Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. Imagine coming home and finding a tow truck hooking up your tractor because an HOA said it was an unauthorized commercial vehicle. No warning, no permission, just pure confidence. I pulled out my deed and my phone, and that's when I realized how far they were willing to go. I've been sitting on this story for almost a year now, and honestly, I still can't believe how it all went down. People keep telling me I should share it, so here goes. This is about the time a homeowners association thought they could roll onto my property and start issuing fines for things they had absolutely no authority over. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well for them. Let me give you some context first. My family has owned this farm for 3 generations. 15 acres of working agricultural land, properly zoned, completely under county jurisdiction. My grandfather bought it back in the 1960s, my dad expanded the operation in the 90s, and I took over about 8 years ago. We grow seasonal produce, keep some chickens, and I do small equipment repair on the side for other local farmers. It's not fancy, but it's ours and it's paid for. The property itself is exactly what you'd expect from a working farm. There's a large barn that definitely needs a new coat of paint, a gravel driveway that gets muddy when it rains, my trusty old tractor that looks like hell but runs like a dream, a decent-sized compost operation near the back, and various piles of materials that I use for ongoing projects. Fencing supplies, lumber, that kind of thing. It's organized chaos, but it works for me. About 2 years ago, everything changed when a developer bought the wooded parcel next to my property. Before that, it had been quiet, just me and the trees. But then the bulldozers showed up, and within 18 months, they'd cleared about 30 acres and put up this massive subdivision. Must have been 60 or 70 houses, all identical, all beige with white trim. They called it something pretentious that I won't repeat here, but it was one of those names that tries too hard to sound upscale and natural at the same time. The contrast between our properties was pretty stark. On their side, perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, decorative lamp posts, those little signs with the neighborhood rules posted at every corner. On my side, actual work being done, dirt under fingernails, the smell of honest labor. I didn't have any problem with them doing their thing over there. Live and let live, right? I figured as long as they stayed on their side of the property line, we'd coexist just fine. I was wrong. The subdivision came with an HOA, which I'd expected. What I hadn't expected was how aggressive they'd be about expanding their perceived territory. The board was run by this guy who I'll just call the president. He was exactly the type you'd imagine, early 50s, never done a day of manual labor in his life, drove a luxury sedan that he waxed every weekend, and had way too much time on his hands. His second in command was this woman who seemed to think being on an HOA board was equivalent to being a federal agent. They both took their positions very seriously. From what I heard through casual conversations with a few of the reasonable neighbors who'd stopped by my farm stand, the president had been bragging about how they were going to clean up the whole area and raise property values. Apparently, he'd been complaining about my farm since day one, calling it an eyesore and claiming it brought down the tone of the neighborhood. Never mind that my farm predated their cookie-cutter houses by about 60 years. I didn't care what they thought or said. My property was mine, properly zoned, and not subject to any HOA rules or regulations. I'd checked with the county when the development first broke ground just to make sure there weren't any surprises. The county clerk had actually laughed when I asked if the new HOA could have any jurisdiction over my land. She told me that agricultural zoning was completely separate and that no HOA could override county regulations. I filed that information away and went back to my life. Everything came to a head on a Tuesday morning in late spring. I was out working on repairing a section of fence line near the front of my property. It was around 10 in the morning, and I was wearing my usual work clothes, old jeans with permanent stains, a faded shirt, steel-toed boots caked in mud. I was focused on getting the fence posts level when I heard the sound of an engine coming up my driveway. I looked up and saw this golf cart puttering toward me. But this wasn't just any golf cart. Someone had mounted a flashing yellow light on top of it like it was some kind of official vehicle. The cart pulled up about 20 feet from where I was working, and out stepped the president and his sidekick. They were both wearing bright orange safety vests over their regular clothes and carrying clipboards. The whole setup would have been hilarious if they hadn't been so serious about it. The president didn't even bother with pleasantries. He just started walking around my property taking photos of my tractor with his phone. His companion was scribbling notes on her clipboard, occasionally pointing at things and shaking her head disapprovingly. They photographed my barn, the pile of fencing materials I was using, even my truck which was parked near the house. I set down my tools and walked over to them. Before I could even ask what they were doing, the president turned to me and thrust a piece of paper in my direction. It was a pre-printed form with the neighborhood logo at the top. The title read "Notice of Violation" in bold letters. I took the paper and glanced at it. It listed several violations: operating commercial vehicles on residential property, visible storage of construction materials, excessive grass height exceeding community standards, and unapproved structures. At the bottom, it demanded compliance within 48 hours or face escalating fines. I looked up at him and asked who he was and what authority he thought he had to be on my property. He puffed up his chest and announced that he was the HOA president and she was the compliance officer. He added that they had full authority over this area under the expanded Phase 2 boundaries of their development. I didn't get angry. I've learned over the years that losing your temper with idiots just makes things worse. Instead, I very calmly asked for both of their full names for my records. The president seemed pleased by this, like he thought I was taking him seriously. He gave me his full name and spelled it out slowly like I was a child. His sidekick did the same. Then I told them in the most neutral tone I could manage that they were currently trespassing on private agricultural land that had been in my family for 3 generations. I explained that my property was not part of their HOA, had never been part of their HOA, and would never be part of their HOA. I asked them to leave immediately. The president actually laughed. He said that according to their Phase 2 expansion maps, my property fell within their jurisdiction. He claimed that the county had approved their expanded boundaries, and that I was now subject to their rules and regulations. Then he tapped the violation notice in my hand and told me I had 48 hours to comply, or they'd start issuing fines. $250 per day for each violation, he said. He made it sound like a threat. I could have argued with them right there. I could have pulled out my phone and shown them the county zoning maps. I could have explained agricultural zoning to them in detail. But I realized something in that moment. These people weren't going to listen to reason. They'd already made up their minds that they had authority here. Arguing would be pointless. So instead, I just nodded slowly and asked if they were finished inspecting my property. The president seemed surprised that I wasn't fighting back. He said yes, they had everything they needed. As they turned to walk back to their ridiculous golf cart, I pulled out my phone and started recording. I got clear video of both of them on my property, their golf cart with its flashing light, and I made sure to capture audio when the president turned back and said loudly that if I didn't comply within 48 hours, the fines would start accumulating and they had the legal authority to place a lien on my property. After they left, I stood there for a moment, watching their golf cart bounce back down my gravel driveway toward their pristine neighborhood. I won't lie, part of me was annoyed, but mostly I was amused. These people had just walked onto my land, threatened me with fines and liens, and documented their entire trespass on their own phones while I documented it on mine. I could have told them right then and there that my land predates their neighborhood by 60 years. But where's the fun in that? I decided to give them enough rope to hang themselves. That evening, I called my insurance agent to make sure my liability coverage was current. Then I called a buddy of mine who's a real estate attorney. I explained the situation to him, and he couldn't stop laughing. He asked me to send him copies of everything: the violation notice, my property deed, the county zoning documentation, and the video I'd taken. He said he'd start putting together a response, but he advised me to wait and see what they did next. In his experience, people like this usually escalate before they realize their mistake. He was right. 3 days later, my mailman handed me a certified letter. It was from the HOA. Inside was an official-looking document stating that I had failed to comply with the violation notice. Therefore, I was being assessed a fine of $500. The letter stated that payment was due within 10 days, and failure to pay would result in additional fines and potential legal action, including the possibility of a lien against my property. I called my attorney and read him the letter. He asked me to scan it and send it over. About an hour later, he called me back. He said that what they were doing was illegal on multiple levels, but he wanted to see how far far they'd actually go before we responded. He suggested I continue documenting everything but not engage with them directly. Let them dig themselves deeper, he said. So I waited, and I documented. I kept copies of everything they sent. I didn't respond to their letters or calls. I just went about my normal farm work, making sure to note every interaction. 2 weeks after the fine letter, I came home from a trip to the feed store to find a tow truck on my property. The driver was in the process of hooking up my tractor. The same one that's been in my family for 30 years and is essential to my farm operations. I pulled up fast and jumped out of my truck. I asked the driver what the hell he thought he was doing. He seemed nervous, but said he'd been hired by the HOA to remove an unauthorized commercial vehicle from the property. He showed me a work order that had my address on it and described my tractor. I told him to stop immediately and showed him my property deed. I explained that this was private agricultural land, that the tractor was legally registered farm equipment, and that if he didn't unhook it right now, I'd be calling the police to report grand theft auto. The driver looked at the paperwork I showed him, then back at his work order. He got on his phone and called someone. I could hear him arguing with whoever was on the other end. Finally, he hung up and started unhooking my tractor. He was cursing under his breath the whole time. As he climbed back into his truck, he told me that the HOA president had assured him this was a legal tow. He said I should talk to them because he wasn't coming back. I looked toward the property line and saw the president standing there, watching. When the tow truck drove off, he actually shouted across the distance that I'd be hearing from their lawyers, that I couldn't just ignore the HOA, that I was in violation of multiple bylaws and my defiance was going to cost me. I didn't shout back. I just pulled out my phone and took a video of him standing there yelling at me from the property line. More documentation. That night, I called my attorney and told him what had happened. He said it was time to respond. He spent the next week putting together what he called a comprehensive legal response. While he did that, I hired a professional surveyor to come out and mark the exact property line between my farm and the subdivision. The surveyor spent 2 days doing his work. When he was finished, he'd placed bright neon pink stakes every 20 feet along the entire boundary. The line was very clear. And it revealed something interesting. The fancy brick entrance sign for the subdivision, the one with their pretentious name in bronze letters, was actually built 3 feet onto my property. It wasn't even close to the line. It was clearly and obviously on my land. I also set up trail cameras at various points along the property line, the kind hunters use, motion activated with night vision. I wanted documentation of anyone crossing onto my land. My attorney finished his response about a week after the tow truck incident. It was beautiful. The letter was addressed to the HOA board and copied to the president personally. It laid out, in precise legal language, that my property was not now, had never been, and would never be subject to HOA jurisdiction. It cited county zoning regulations, state property laws, and included certified copies of my deed and the survey results. But that wasn't all. The letter also included a bill. My attorney itemized everything, his legal fees, the surveyor costs, my time dealing with their harassment. The total came to just over $8,000. And then came the best part. The letter noted that their entrance sign was encroaching on my property by approximately 3 feet. It gave them 30 days to remove the sign at their own expense. If they failed to do so, I reserved the right to remove it myself using whatever means I deemed appropriate. My attorney delivered the letter personally to the HOA board during one of their monthly meetings. He told me later that the room went completely silent when he read certain parts aloud. Several board members apparently started arguing with the president immediately, asking why he'd never verified jurisdiction before harassing me. I thought that might be the end of it, I really did, but the president wasn't ready to admit defeat. 4 days after my attorney delivered that letter, I was outside working on repairing a chicken coop when I saw the president marching across my property toward me. He'd walked right past the bright pink survey stakes, past the no trespassing signs I'd posted, and was heading straight for where I was working. Before he got within 50 feet of me, I pulled out my phone and called the county sheriff's office. Not the city police, because I'm outside city limits. The actual county sheriff. I explained that I had a trespasser on my agricultural property who'd been previously warned. The dispatcher said they'd send someone right away. The president reached me just as I hung up. His face was red, and he was angrier than I'd ever seen anyone. He started shouting about how I thought I was so smart getting a lawyer involved. He said I'd embarrassed him in front of the whole board. He demanded to know who I thought I was, threatening to tear down their entrance sign. He said the sign represented tens of thousands of dollars of investment, and there was no way I could legally touch it. I stayed calm. I told him he was trespassing and that law enforcement was on the way. He laughed and said that the sheriff's department would take one look at my farm and side with him, that I was clearly running some kind of unlicensed business and that he'd make sure every county inspector knew about it. His sidekick had followed him onto my property too, and she was recording the whole thing on her phone. She said they were documenting my threats and aggressive behavior. I almost laughed at that, considering I was standing completely still with my hands at my sides while the president was the one shouting and gesturing wildly. About 15 minutes later, a sheriff's patrol vehicle came up my driveway. The deputy who got out was someone I'd seen around at local farm bureau meetings. He nodded at me, then turned his attention to the president, who immediately launched into a tirade about how I was refusing to comply with community standards and making threats about destroying property. The deputy let him talk for about 2 minutes, then held up a hand. He asked the president if he lived on this property. The president said no, but that he was the HOA president for the adjacent neighborhood. The deputy asked if the president had permission to be on this property. The president said he didn't need permission because my property was part of the HOA boundaries. The deputy asked me if I'd given permission. I said no. I also mentioned that I'd previously asked both the president and his companion to leave my property and that they'd ignored that request. The deputy turned back to the president and explained that this was private agricultural land properly zoned and not subject to any HOA authority. The president started to argue, but the deputy cut him off. He said that the property line had been professionally surveyed and that they were currently standing about 100 feet onto my land without permission. That constituted criminal trespass. The president's face went from red to white. His companion had stopped recording. The deputy issued formal trespass warnings to both of them right there. He explained that if either of them set foot on my property again without my explicit permission or a court order, they would be arrested and charged with criminal trespass. He made them repeat back to him that they understood. Then he escorted them off my property, past all those pink survey stakes, back to the subdivision. After they left, the deputy came back and talked to me for a few minutes. He said he'd been hearing things about the new HOA causing problems. Apparently, they'd been aggressive with several other nearby property owners too, trying to force people to comply with rules that didn't apply to them. He suggested I keep documenting everything and consider a restraining order if they continued to harass me. Over the next few weeks, things got interesting. My trail cameras caught the president walking along the property line multiple times, always staying just barely on his side. Once I caught him on camera taking measurements of the entrance sign, probably trying to figure out if my surveyor was right about the encroachment. The HOA held an emergency meeting. I know this because one of the reasonable neighbors from the subdivision came by my farm stand and told me about it. Apparently, several board members were furious with the president for getting them into this mess. The HOA's insurance company had been notified about the potential lawsuit and their premiums were going up. The legal fees were already over $15,000, and they hadn't even started dealing with the sign encroachment issue. The neighbor also told me that the president had assured the board that the sign was legally placed and that I was bluffing about tearing it down. He'd apparently told everyone that I wouldn't dare touch it because I'd be liable for the cost of replacement. 2 weeks before the 30-day deadline in my attorney's letter, I got a call from a different law firm. They represented the HOA and wanted to discuss a resolution. I referred them to my attorney. The negotiations took about a week. Their position initially was that the sign encroachment was a minor issue and that they'd be willing to pay me a token amount, maybe $1,000, to leave it in place. My attorney's response was that the sign was on my property without permission, that I'd given them notice to remove it, and that if they wanted to keep it there, they'd need to pay fair market value for an easement. We went back and forth. They argued that the sign wasn't really hurting anything. My attorney pointed out that it was 3 feet onto my property, that it was a permanent structure, and that it interfered with my property rights. He also reminded them that their president had committed criminal trespass, attempted to levy fines he had no authority to levy, and tried to have my farm equipment illegally towed. Any lawsuit would include all of that. They came back with an offer of $5,000 for a permanent easement. My attorney countered with $20,000. We settled at $15,000. The agreement was pretty straightforward. In exchange for $15,000, I would grant the HOA a permanent easement for the 3-foot strip of land where their sign was located. They'd be responsible for all maintenance of that area. The agreement also included a clause that the HOA, its board members, and its agents would have no authority over any other part of my property, now or in the future, and it required them to notify all current and future homeowners that my farm was not part of the HOA and not subject to any of their rules. The check arrived about 2 weeks later, $15,000. There was a special board meeting after that. The reasonable neighbor stopped by again to give me the update. Apparently, the meeting got heated. Several homeowners were furious that the HOA had spent over $20,000 total in legal fees, settlements, and increased insurance premiums because the president had decided to go after a farm that wasn't even in their jurisdiction. There was a motion for a vote of no confidence. The president tried to defend himself, claiming he'd been acting in the best interest of property values, but it didn't matter. He was voted out. His companion resigned from the board entirely the next day. The new board president was one of the reasonable neighbors. One of the first things he did was send me a formal apology letter signed by the entire board. It acknowledged that the previous board had acted inappropriately and without proper authority. It confirmed that my property was not part of the HOA and never had been, and it requested that we maintain good neighbor relations going forward. I appreciated the gesture. I wrote back saying that I had no issue with the subdivision or its residents, only with the previous board's overreach. I mentioned that I'd be happy to continue operating my farm stand on weekends if their residents wanted access to local produce. As for that $15,000, I put it to good use. I'd been needing to upgrade some equipment for a while, and this was the perfect opportunity. I bought a brand new manure spreader. Top-of-the-line model, biggest one the dealer had, and I made sure to park it right on the property line, clearly visible from the president's house. It was perfectly legal, properly registered farm equipment, and it sat there gleaming in the sun. The ex-president sold his house about 4 months later. I heard through the neighbor network that he couldn't stand living next to my farm anymore. Apparently, every time he looked out his back window and saw my equipment, my barn, my compost pile, it reminded him of how badly he'd screwed up. The new family that moved into his house seems nice. They've got kids who love visiting the farm stand and looking at the chickens. The dad came by once to ask about fresh eggs, and we got to talking. I mentioned that I'd had a bit of trouble with the previous HOA board. He laughed and said he'd heard about it during the closing process. Apparently, it had become a cautionary tale in the neighborhood about what happens when you assume authority you don't have. Looking back on the whole situation, I'm still amazed at how it played out. These people rolled onto my property, threatened me with fines and liens, tried to tow my tractor, and genuinely believed they had the authority to control what I did on land my family had owned for 3 generations. They never once stopped to verify their jurisdiction. They just assumed that because they'd formed an HOA for their new subdivision, they could extend that authority to anyone nearby. The irony is that if they'd approached me differently from the start, we probably could have avoided the whole mess. If the president had knocked on my door, introduced himself politely, and maybe expressed some concerns about property boundaries or whatever, I would have explained the zoning situation calmly. We could have talked it through like adults. Instead, he came in aggressive, throwing around authority he didn't have, and it cost his HOA a lot of money. I learned some lessons too. I learned the importance of documentation. Every photo, every video, every written communication ended up being valuable. I learned that sometimes it's better to let people dig their own holes rather than trying to reason with them immediately. And I learned that knowing your property rights inside and out is crucial when dealing with organizations that might try to overreach. The farm is still here, still operating, still doing what it's done for 3 generations. My tractor still looks like hell but runs perfectly. The compost pile is still near the back. The barn still needs paint. And now I have a shiny new manure spreader parked right where everyone in the subdivision can see it. They wanted to act like enforcers and police my farm. They wanted to bring their HOA rules onto land that had been producing food since before most of them were born. In the end, they funded my farm's new equipment and learned a valuable lesson about county zoning and property rights. Out here, we don't play by HOA rules. We play by the actual law, and when someone tries to overstep, well, sometimes you just have to let them learn the hard way. The subdivision is still there, still full of identical houses and manicured lawns. And right next door is my farm, unchanged and unbothered. The contrast probably drives some people crazy, but that's their problem. This is working agricultural land, properly zoned, properly maintained, and now properly defended against anyone who thinks they can roll up and start issuing orders. Every time I fire up that manure spreader, especially on hot summer days when the wind is blowing just right toward where the ex-president used to live, I smile. Not because I'm trying to be malicious, but because it's a reminder that some battles are worth fighting, some authority is worth challenging, and sometimes the little guy with dirt under his fingernails can come out on top against people who think power comes from a clipboard and a golf cart with a flashing light. The next one is a malicious compliance story. My parents and my siblings were invited to eat at my brother's-in-law parents' house. We just got back from my maternal grandpa's side. 7 hours drive. Because traffic congestion was insane during festive season, my dad drove halfway and switched with my mom and back to him. He doesn't trust me to drive ever, especially because this is his precious car. And younger brother just got his driving license, so we trust him less. And my youngest brother is 13, so naturally he cannot drive. I offered to drive, he always said no. Again, during this trip, I told him to let me drive. He refused, so I just gives up offering. When we arrived at my BIL parents' house, they cheerfully greeted us. Food was served buffet style, you pick whatever you want. They have a lot of guests over, so food was a little low. So we have to wait a bit for my BIL and his siblings to serve more. The host told us to grab something first. My siblings and I went to grab ourselves a bowl of curry noodles. We were starving because our dad refused to stop for food during the trip back from Grandpa. We all took a seat in the living room. I have 3 kids and all are so ungrateful even though I drove everyone here and so tired. No one helped me get some food, my father suddenly said loudly in front of everyone. We all paused eating. Everyone including my BIL's sister looked awkwardly. I only had a bite. I turned to him and simply gave him my bowl. For some reason he looked more embarrassed even though he asked for it. He told me to grab some more chicken. I quietly got up, filled the bowl with more chicken, and give it to him. I didn't grab another bowl to myself. Lost my appetite. He took a few bites and gives me back the bowl, saying he didn't want it and I can keep eating it. You dramatically asked for it so much, you should finish it, I told him. He insisted he didn't feel like eating these and wanted something else. He only ate 3 bites and had enough. The host actually ended up serving him, specifically had a whole meal for him as a sign of respect because he's my BIL-in-law. I end up finishing the bowl he didn't want. It was annoying. My father is a narcissist who enjoys painting us as his horrible, abusive children. He likes doing these sort of things for attention, so strangers can call us terrible and him as some kind of victim. Today, my older sister invited the whole family to go to her close friend's house to eat and celebrate the festive occasion. I went with my sister and BIL with their car. We talked about what happened. My older sister found out about what happened through her sister-in-law. Even her sister-in-law said it was a bit messed up. He didn't ask his kids first if they could get him a bowl, instead just call out everyone and made a scene. She said she felt bad for me because my father was totally humiliating me instead of being a normal human being by simply ask. And she was right, his goal was to humiliate us in front of others. He is a pretty traditional guy who expects everyone to read his mind like when he wanted to eat or drink. So cue malicious compliance. We were the only family invited to my sister's friend house. And her family are very hospitable. They serve a lot of food, like 5 whole big cow bones of soup, all buffet table full of food. Since I arrived earlier with my sister and BIL, I quickly piled some food on a plate. Round 1, steamed rice dish with peanut sauce. The moment my father stepped foot into the house, I handed him the plate. He was dumbfounded and said he hadn't even greeted the host. I smiled and said, no, you need to eat. This is for you. And he reluctantly took the plate. I watched him like a hawk, as soon as he finished the first plate and was chatting with the host. Round 2, I grabbed a bowl, filled it with chicken soup and noodles, and I went up to him and handed it to him. Here, Dad, there's plenty of food for you. He couldn't say no in front of the host. My mom was totally oblivious on what I was doing and went to grab him a whole bowl of cow bone soup because Dad likes meat better than chicken. Pretty sure he had to say no to it because the portion are massive compared to the chicken I give him, after he finished the chicken noodles. Round 3, I went and grabbed some fries and meatballs, put a nice side of sauce on the side and handed him a plate. He kept eating. Round 4, I grabbed 3 slices of watermelon, and he refused. He can't eat anymore. Round 5, the host brought out a plate of fried rice, and I can't help but grin as I loudly say, "That's for Dad." and he ended up having to eat half, and Mom piled some more meat on his plate because that's his favorite round 6. I grabbed more fries and meatballs for him, and by now I think he realized what I was doing. He said no and ran out of the house and asked the host to continue speaking outside. Such a shame I end up eating the 6th plate. I went back home and my sister and BIL laughed and commented how my dad looked so annoyed by the first plate I give him. Oh my? Whatever the reason, he wanted me to serve him food, I served him food. He wanted me to read his mind, so I thought I know exactly what he wanted to eat, so I grabbed everything he should eat first. I was simply being a good daughter and make sure he properly eat. And I have no plan on stopping. From now on, I should serve him food first, and he will never starve. My poor father deserves the best, after all. The next one is an entitled people story. I know from the title that this doesn't seem all that entitled, but if you knew my sister, you'd know she's a mess of a person. From being a cheating wife to neglectful parent to power plays for control to leaving our grandparents with a trailer mortgage and running off to party. This is just one of the more weird things she put us through back in the day. I assume you're wondering what series of movies was so epic to her that no one could call anything else epic in her presence. Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Fast and Furious, Dirty Harry, Terminator, Transformers? No, it was the Twilight movies. You know, the ones with the glittering vampires. Despite being a married woman with kids at the time, my sister was gaga fangirl obsessed with both the main vampire and werewolf guys. If either of them walked through the door to whisk her away, I've no doubt she'd have gone with them in a heartbeat. Even though the werewolf guy got his big break playing Shark Boy. It started when I mentioned the trailer for a new movie coming out at the time looked so epic. And then she snapped at me, like full-on mood swing snapped. Then she told me not to use that word around her. And when I asked what she meant, she tried to get me to understand what that word was without saying it. But because I was clueless, finally she had to just say it. She didn't want me to say epic around her, and when I asked why, she said that ever since she started watching the Twilight movies, she couldn't see anything else as epic, which weirded me out. She also knew way too much about the Twilight movies at the time, and what she didn't know, she'd look up on her phone. I think she even had a poster of the werewolf guy on the living room wall. Her whole hate for the word epic got so bad she was actively waiting and listening if I said it in her general vicinity. I think she even got in an argument with our mother about it. Once just to test the waters. I think it was at Christmas dinner or something. But I was talking with relatives and I mentioned something being epic, and out of the corner of my eye I saw her rubberneck to look at me with a big frown on her face so fast that she could have given herself a neck injury. I've only seen her do that when something she really hates is said or done. Unfortunately, at the time, I was having to stay over at her house once or twice a week to help out with her kids while her husband was off doing military training. And then one day, I couldn't take it anymore. Without really thinking about it, I mentioned how a new video game looked epic. I don't remember which game specifically. But knowing my tastes, and around the general time this happened, maybe Dynasty Warriors Gundam 3, that game was epic to me since I'm a huge Universal Century Gundam fan. But my sister just lost it on me for calling it epic, and she even went so far to say it was anything but epic. I finally had enough and told her she didn't have the right to tell me what I thought was epic and what wasn't. She tried to turn it on me by acting sad and said I didn't understand how she felt. I told her she didn't understand how I felt either. And she also didn't have the right to tell me I couldn't say epic when it was such a common word. It's not even a bad word to use. She cursed like a trucker in front of her young children, and yet epic was the word she had issue with. And frankly, I was done caring about her opinion on it. She got mad but stopped trying to police my saying epic anymore. And eventually her Twilight obsession died down for good. Anyway, thank you for watching.